From a Nobel Prize winner contributing just one sentence to a supermodel biting her co-star to the bone, the making of Howard Hawks' Egyptian epic was stranger than any ancient curse. Behind the sweaty extras and towering sets lurked bizarre casting disasters, surreal script meetings with a poodle, and a ban that lasted decades. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Land of the Pharaohs. Fact 1. Faulkner's one-sentence contribution. William Faulkner was one of America's greatest writers, a Nobel Prize-winning novelist whose complex, poetic prose earned him a permanent place in literary history. But when director Howard Hawks brought him onto Land of the Pharaohs in 1954, Faulkner's contribution to the entire screenplay was shockingly minimal. According to accounts from the production, after weeks of work and countless meetings, Faulkner's sole addition to the final script was a single line of dialogue. In a scene where the pharaoh visits his chief architect after years of pyramid construction, he simply asks, "So, how is the job getting along?" That one question was apparently the extent of Faulkner's input that made it into the finished film. The rest of his time on the project was reportedly spent drinking heavily and obsessively, trying to secure bottles of a rare French wine called Chassagne Montrachet from 1949 from a local restaurant. Hawks had summoned his writing team to St. Moritz in Switzerland, where he was on a ski vacation hoping to develop the script, but little actual progress was made. Despite this minimal contribution, Faulkner received full screenwriting credit alongside Harry Kernitz and Harold Jack Bloom. After this production wrapped, the legendary author returned to Mississippi and never wrote another screenplay again, ending a Hollywood career that had included work on classics like The Big Sleep and To Have and Have Not. Fact 2. The poolside pyramid pitch. The origins of Land of the Pharaohs might be one of the most casual and spontaneous deals in Hollywood history. In the late summer of 1953, director Howard Hawks was relaxing by the pool at the Hotel du Cap at Eden Rock on the French Riviera, fresh off the success of his film, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Hawks was lounging in plaid swimming trunks when he started gazing at the horizon, and at some point he turned to his companion and suddenly announced, "Noel, I am going to build a pyramid." Just like that, the idea for an epic film about ancient Egypt and the construction of the Great Pyramid was born on the spot. But the story gets even more remarkable, because by pure coincidence, studio head Jack Warner had anchored his yacht in the Mediterranean just a few feet away from where Hawks was staying. Hawks seized the opportunity and approached Warner about financing his spontaneous pyramid project. The two men sat down together, and over the course of a few dry martinis, they hammered out a deal right there on the Riviera. Warner agreed on the spot to have his studio finance the movie, and the entire multi-million-dollar production was greenlit during what was essentially a vacation conversation. It's a far cry from the typical Hollywood development process with its endless meetings, pitches, and negotiations. Fact 3. Model bit star to escape contract. Howard Hawks originally wanted fashion model Ivy Nicholson to play the female lead role of Princess Nellifer in Land of the Pharaohs, hoping to transform her into a movie star. Nicholson was a well-known model in the 1950s who had appeared on the covers of Vogue, Elle, and other major fashion magazines, and Hawks flew her all the way to Egypt for her screen test. However, things went spectacularly wrong during the audition. Nicholson objected to the multi-year studio contract that came with the role, but instead of simply declining the part or negotiating different terms, she took a much more dramatic approach. During her screen test with actor Jack Hawkins, who was playing the Pharaoh, Nicholson was instructed to playfully nip at his hand as part of the scene. She took the direction to an extreme level and bit Jack Hawkins' hand so hard that she bit him to the bone, causing a serious injury. According to later accounts, this was Nicholson's deliberate way of getting out of the contract she didn't want to sign. The production designer on the film described her as very beautiful but a little unstable. Hawks immediately fired her and replaced her with a young British actress named Joan Collins, who would go on to make her American film debut in the role. As one photographer who knew Nicholson later said, she couldn't just say the job wasn't working for her, she had to do something extreme instead. Fact 4. Kentucky Colonel Pharaoh. One of the biggest creative challenges Howard Hawks faced during the production of Land of the Pharaohs was figuring out how an ancient Egyptian ruler should actually speak on screen. Hawks openly admitted that he had no idea how to write dialogue for a pharaoh, and this problem plagued the entire writing process. The challenge was that they were trying to create a character who lived thousands of years ago in a completely different culture, and there was no real way to know what kind of speech patterns or mannerisms would feel authentic. When Hawks voiced this concern to his screenwriting team, William Faulkner came up with a rather unusual suggestion. He proposed that they could make the pharaoh sound like a Kentucky colonel, drawing on the formal but folksy speech patterns of Southern gentlemen that Faulkner knew well from his own Mississippi background. Meanwhile, the other writer on the project, Harry Kurnitz, had a completely different idea and suggested they could model the pharaoh's dialogue after King Lear, giving him the grand, theatrical style of Shakespearean royalty. Both suggestions show just how lost the writers were in trying to crack this particular character, reaching for wildly different reference points from American regional culture and classical English drama. In the end, neither approach satisfied Hawks, and the director continued to struggle with the pharaoh's voice throughout the production. Hawks later cited this fundamental uncertainty about how the character should talk as one of his main problems with the entire film, and it contributed to his overall unhappiness with the project. Fact 5. Script meeting with a miniature poodle. When it came time to work on the screenplay for Land of the Pharaohs, Howard Hawks had a rather unconventional approach to organizing his writing sessions. Instead of setting up meetings in Los Angeles or at the studio, Hawks summoned his entire writing team to St. Moritz, Switzerland, where he had decided to take a ski vacation with his wife Dee. The writers, including William Faulkner and the others working on the script, were expected to travel all the way to this exclusive Swiss alpine resort to discuss the film while Hawks enjoyed his winter getaway. The setting for these script conferences was already unusual enough, but what made it even more surreal was that Hawks brought along his miniature poodle to these meetings. So the writers found themselves in St. Moritz, trying to develop dialogue and plot points for an ancient Egyptian epic, while the director's small dog was present in the room. According to accounts from people who were there, the entire arrangement was far from productive. The script meetings achieved very little actual progress, with the writers struggling to make headway on the story while Hawks was more focused on his vacation activities. The production designer, Alexander Trauner, had already designed the elaborate sets before anyone had even finished writing the script, and he reportedly told the team that with all the visual work already done, they could write whatever they wanted because everything was already ready to go. This backwards approach to filmmaking, combined with the distracted atmosphere of a ski resort, meant the screenplay remained a work in progress even as production moved forward. Fact 6. Sidney Chaplin's Ferrari splurge. Sidney Chaplin, the son of legendary silent film star Charlie Chaplin, had a supporting role in Land of the Pharaohs, playing the character Trene, who serves as the captain of the guards and becomes one of the villains in the story. Sidney was trying to build his own acting career separate from his famous father's shadow, and this Egyptian epic gave him a chance to work on a major Hollywood production with a significant budget. Howard Hawks was friends with the Chaplin family and cast Sidney in the role, giving him a decent paycheck for his work on the film. However, what Sidney did with that money became one of the more memorable stories from the production. According to accounts from people who were there during filming, Sidney Chaplin took his entire salary from Land of the Pharaohs and immediately spent every single dollar on purchasing a brand new Ferrari. This wasn't just a portion of his earnings or a down payment. He used the complete amount he was paid for the movie to buy the luxury Italian sports car. The purchase shows both the appeal of these exotic automobiles in the 1950s and perhaps a certain carefree attitude about money that Sidney had at the time. While other cast and crew members were saving their paychecks or using them for practical expenses, Sidney chose to put all of his earnings into one extravagant purchase. The Ferrari represented the glamorous lifestyle that many people in Hollywood aspired to during that era, and for Sidney Chaplin, it was apparently worth spending everything he made from the film to own one of these coveted vehicles. Fact 7. 60 extras suffered heat stroke in one day. The location shooting in Egypt for Land of the Pharaohs proved to be one of the most physically demanding productions in Hollywood history, and the conditions led to a serious health crisis on set. The international crew and the thousands of Egyptian extras had to work in absolutely brutal desert heat, with temperatures climbing as high as 128 degrees Fahrenheit during the filming. One journalist who visited the set described it as by far the toughest location anyone on the crew had ever experienced in their careers. The extreme heat became more than just uncomfortable, it turned dangerous. On one particularly bad day during the production, approximately 60 extras collapsed from heat stroke and had to receive medical attention. This mass casualty event showed just how punishing the conditions were for everyone involved in making the film. The situation was made even worse by the timing of the shoot because part of the filming took place during the Islamic holy month of Ramadan. Many of the Muslim extras who were working on the film were observing the religious fast, which meant they were not allowed to eat or drink anything during daylight hours. Trying to work in extreme desert heat while fasting created an incredibly dangerous combination that put these workers at even greater risk of heat-related illness. The production team had thousands of extras on set each day, with the Egyptian government supplying many of them, including soldiers from the Egyptian army. But the harsh conditions tested everyone's physical limits and turned what was meant to be a spectacular Hollywood epic into a genuine survival challenge for the people working on it. Fact 8. Banned for looking too Jewish. After all the effort and expense of filming Land of the Pharaohs on location in Egypt, with thousands of Egyptian extras and the cooperation of the government, the finished film was banned in the country where much of it was actually shot. The official reason given by Egypt's censorship board was that the movie contained a distortion of historical facts, but according to accounts from people involved with the production, the real reason was far more troubling and had nothing to do with historical accuracy. The ban apparently stemmed from the appearance of British actor James Robertson Justice, who played Vashtar, the enslaved architect who designs the pyramid's security system in the film. Justice was a distinguished and well-connected actor who was actually a personal friend of the British royal family, giving him significant social standing in England. However, when the censorship board of the new Nasser regime in Egypt reviewed the completed film, they objected to Justice's casting because they felt he looked too Jewish. This reasoning was both absurd and deeply offensive, especially considering that Justice wasn't Jewish and was simply playing a fictional character in an ancient Egyptian setting. The decision reflected the political tensions and prejudices of the time in the Middle East during the 1950s. The ban meant that Egyptian audiences never got to see the film in theaters, despite the fact that their own country had provided the locations, the extras, and significant support for the production. The irony of Egypt banning a film that showcased their most famous ancient monument and employed thousands of Egyptian workers wasn't lost on the people involved with making it. Fact 9. Joan Collins expected to be fired daily. When Joan Collins stepped into the role of Princess Nellifer after Ivy Nicholson's dramatic exit from the production, she found herself in an extremely uncomfortable position that filled her with anxiety throughout the early days of filming. Collins was a young British actress making her first major American film, and she knew she was essentially the second choice for the role after the original actress had been fired for biting her co-star. What made the situation even more stressful was that director Howard Hawks made it clear he wasn't particularly happy with Collins either, and she could sense his dissatisfaction with her performance. According to Collins's own later accounts of the experience, she spent several days walking onto the set each morning, fully expecting to receive notice that she was being let go from the production. The fear of being fired hung over her constantly during those first days of shooting, and she never felt secure in the role even as she continued to show up and do the work. Hawks had a reputation for being demanding and particular about his casting choices, and Collins was well aware that he had already fired one actress from this exact part, so there was no reason to think he wouldn't do it again if he remained unhappy. Despite Hawks' dissatisfaction and Collins' own fears about losing the job, she somehow managed to hold on to the role and complete the film. Her performance as the scheming and seductive Princess Nelifer would go on to become one of the most memorable elements of Land of the Pharaohs, even though the experience of making it was filled with uncertainty and stress for the young actress. Fact 10. 9,187. Extras in a single scene. Land of the Pharaohs featured some of the most massive crowd scenes ever captured on film, and Warner Brothers made sure everyone knew about it through their publicity materials. The studio's press office claimed that exactly 9,787 extras appeared in a single scene during the production, which would make it one of the largest gatherings of people ever assembled for a movie at that time. This incredibly specific number suggests that someone actually counted every single person who appeared in that particular shot, though it's also possible the figure was somewhat exaggerated for promotional purposes, as studios often did in that era. Regardless of whether the exact count was completely accurate, there's no question that the scale of the crowd scenes was genuinely impressive and required an enormous logistical effort to coordinate. The Egyptian government played a crucial role in making these massive scenes possible by supplying a significant portion of the extras needed for the film. According to production records, approximately half of those thousands of extras were actually soldiers from the Egyptian army, who were provided by the government to participate in the filming. Howard Hawks had between 3,000 and 10,000 extras working on the set each day during the 50-plus day shooting schedule in Egypt, depending on which scenes were being filmed. Managing this many people in the desert heat while trying to coordinate their movements for the camera was a monumental challenge that required multiple assistant directors and careful planning. The sheer number of people involved helped create the epic scale that the filmmakers were trying to achieve in depicting ancient Egypt. Fact 11. Cecil B. DeMille sent spies. While Howard Hawks was filming Land of the Pharaohs in Egypt during 1954, the production received some unexpected visitors who weren't just there to watch the filmmaking process out of casual interest. According to accounts from people who were on set at the time, several representatives from Paramount Pictures showed up at the location and began carefully observing everything that was happening during the shoot. These emissaries walked around the Egyptian filming locations, taking what were described as copious notes about every aspect of the production, from how the crowd scenes were being organized to the technical approaches being used to capture the massive scale of the ancient world. The reason for this corporate espionage was that the legendary director Cecil B. DeMille was in the early stages of preparing his own biblical epic called The Ten Commandments for Paramount, and he wanted to know exactly what his competition at Warner Brothers was doing with their Egyptian spectacular. DeMille was famous for his own large-scale historical epics and had already made one version of the Ten Commandments back in the silent era. But he was planning an even bigger remake that would also feature massive crowd scenes and Egyptian locations. By sending these observers to spy on the Hawks production, DeMille and Paramount could gather intelligence about what techniques were working, what challenges the other studio was facing, and potentially learn from both the successes and mistakes of Land of the Pharaohs before they began their own shoot. This kind of competitive intelligence gathering wasn't uncommon in Hollywood, but it shows just how seriously the studios took these expensive epic productions and how eager they were to gain any advantage over their rivals. Fact 12. Hawks' 4-year directing hiatus. Land of the Pharaohs turned out to be Howard Hawks' first major commercial failure in a distinguished career that had included hits across multiple genres, and the experience affected him deeply, both professionally and personally. The film cost approximately $3,150,000 to produce, which was an enormous budget for 1955, but it failed to earn back its production costs at the box office, falling short by about $450,000. The combination of lukewarm critical reviews and disappointing audience response hit Hawks particularly hard because he had invested so much time and effort into the production, spending months in Egypt dealing with difficult conditions and massive logistical challenges. The failure demoralized Hawks to such an extent that he made the decision to step away from directing entirely and take an extended break from filmmaking. He left Hollywood and spent time traveling through Europe, essentially taking what amounted to a sabbatical from his career. This gap between Land of the Pharaohs in 1955 and his next film, Rio Bravo, in 1959, represented a 4-year period without directing a single movie, which was the longest break between films in Hawks' entire career up to that point. Even years later, Hawks remained sensitive about the film and his disappointment with how it turned out. When retrospectives of his work were organized to celebrate his achievements as a director, Hawks himself actually prevented Land of the Pharaohs from being included in the screenings, essentially disowning the film and not wanting audiences to see it as part of his body of work. Fact 13. Faulkner never wrote for movies again. Land of the Pharaohs marked the end of William Faulkner's long and complicated relationship with Hollywood, bringing to a close a screenwriting career that had lasted for more than 2 decades. Faulkner had first come to California to work in the film industry back in 1932 when director Howard Hawks, who was impressed by his literary work, invited him to adapt one of his short stories into a film. Over the years that followed, Faulkner had worked on approximately 50 different film projects for various studios, though many of his scripts were, never produced, and some of his contributions went uncredited. His most notable screenwriting work included collaborations with Hawks on classic films like To Have and Have Not in 1945 and The Big Sleep in 1946, both starring Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Despite these successes, Faulkner had always had a conflicted relationship with Hollywood and screenwriting, often feeling that the work was beneath his talents as a novelist, and that the collaborative nature of filmmaking compromised his artistic vision. After the frustrating experience of working on Land of the Pharaohs, where his contributions were minimal and the entire production seemed chaotic and unfocused, Faulkner made the decision to leave Hollywood for good. He returned to his home in Oxford, Mississippi, and devoted the remaining years of his life exclusively to his novels and short stories, never writing another screenplay or accepting another offer from the film industry. This decision allowed him to focus entirely on the literary work that had earned him the Nobel Prize, but it also meant that one of America's greatest writers walked away from Hollywood after an experience that left him disillusioned with the entire process of making movies. Fact 14. Martin Scorsese's childhood favorite. While Land of the Pharaohs was considered a disappointment when it was first released in 1955 and struggled to find an audience during its initial theatrical run, the film found at least one extremely enthusiastic young fan who would go on to become one of cinema's greatest directors. Martin Scorsese, who was a child growing up in New York City when the film came out, saw Land of the Pharaohs, and it immediately became his favorite movie. Scorsese has spoken publicly about his love for the film multiple times over the years, explaining that as a young boy, he was completely captivated by the scale and spectacle of Hawks' Egyptian epic. The massive crowd scenes filmed in CinemaScope, the elaborate sets, and the grand scope of the production left a lasting impression on him during his formative years when he was first discovering his passion for movies. What makes this especially remarkable is that Scorsese's admiration for the film continued well into his adulthood, long after he became an acclaimed filmmaker himself, with classics like Taxi Driver and Raging Bull to his credit. He has openly described Land of the Pharaohs as one of his guilty pleasures, acknowledging that while it may not be considered a masterpiece by most critics or film historians, he still finds great value and enjoyment in watching it. Scorsese's enthusiastic support for the film helped contribute to its gradual rehabilitation over the decades, as his endorsement encouraged other film lovers to give it a second look. His advocacy played a significant role in the movie, eventually being recognized as a cult classic rather than just being dismissed as a failed Hawks project, and his support even led to restoration efforts for the film. Fact 15. Extras chanted, "Fuck Warner Brothers." One of the biggest logistical challenges during the filming of Land of the Pharaohs was coordinating the movements of thousands of extras who had to work together in perfect rhythm, especially during scenes where they were dragging massive fake stone blocks across the desert to simulate the construction of the pyramid. Second Unit Director Noel Howard came up with a creative solution to keep all these people moving in unison by having a singer's voice amplified through microphones across the set, giving the extras something to chant along with as they pulled the heavy props. Howard needed short, rhythmic phrases that would be easy for the workers to repeat and that would help them maintain a steady pace while performing this exhausting physical labor under the brutal Egyptian sun. He started with advertising slogans that everyone would recognize, having the masses of extras chant phrases like "Smoke Chesterfield" and "Drink Coca-Cola" as they hauled the stone blocks across the sand. After several lengthy rehearsals, the extras grew bored with repeating the same commercial catchphrases over and over again, and Howard found himself running out of suitable slogans to use. In a moment of frustration and improvisation, he decided to have some fun at the studio's expense and taught the workers to chant a much more profane phrase directed at the company financing the entire production. The thousands of dusty, sweating extras then began rhythmically shouting an obscenity about Warner Brothers as they dragged the blocks, while Howard Hawks himself watched the scene impassively from his position before climbing into his Jeep to head back to his hotel for his daily round of golf and evening cocktails.